You can't certify a feeling. You cannot audit a good intention. For years, inclusion was something you hoped for and waited on. What if hope was never the tool? What if you could engineer it and build it into a standard the world could share? Hello, friends, and welcome to I Know I Belong When, an innovation, unbiased production where bold voices, curious stories, and authentic impact amplify knowing that you are invited, seen, heard, and needed. Our conversations go from the boardrooms to the break rooms, from the sidewalks to our living rooms, from our relationships to ourselves. We explore the full spectrum of belonging, the joy of being seen, the pain of being left out, and the courage it takes to build spaces where every identity is welcomed, valued, and loved. We also hold space for each of our unique identities to joyfully prosper and thrive. I am your host, Christopher Bylone, someone who believes knowing you belong is a birthright. Most people treat inclusion like a feeling, something you hope for, something you write into a value statement and revisit once a year. What if it is something you can build? What if belonging has a blueprint, a foundation, a standard you can engineer and certify? Our guest has been answering those questions for his entire career. Meet Effenus Henderson. He is the president and CEO of HenderWorks, a strategy and intellectual property firm grounded in more than 40 years of doing the work, not just describing it. When the world needed a shared language for diversity and inclusion, he did not write another opinion. He convened the international working group that produced the ISO 30415, the first global standard of its kind. Listen to that line again. There is an international standard for inclusion, and Effenus helped write it. His range is the surprise. He has addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations on intercultural diversity. He has authored 3 books, including The Architecture of Inclusion, a set of frameworks for leaders who want to build equity into the structure of an organization, not printed on a wall. He has co-founded the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion because the work has to outlast any single news cycle. Here is the part that explains everything. The man who helped write an international standard has also written more than 60 original songs. He will tell you that equity work without a soul does not last. He golfs. He bleeds Seattle Seahawks blue. The architecture has a heartbeat. Belonging, it turns out, can be designed. Right now, while many voices are going quiet, Effenus is choosing to get more precise. That architect is who you are about to hear from. Effenus Henderson, welcome to I Know I Belong When.
Thank you so much. I know I belong because over the years I've learned how to bring more of myself to the work, bring myself to the community, bring myself to relationships so that people know who I am, they know what I am about. And really, I try to belong by sharing more about who I am and what I do. And I do that through word, writing, and song. By the way, I'm not a singer. I'm not a producer, but I have utilized technology because I think that's something that will allow people to belong even more so in the coming years. In fact, I actually produced a I Know I Belong song for this segment here as well. I'll share it with you.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. We'll have to play it. We will have to play it. So please send that along and we'll find a way to incorporate that into the show somehow. So that's just excellent. So let's get into this conversation, Effenus. You have spent more than 40 years turning belonging from hope into a structure. In one sentence, what changes for a leader the day they stop aspiring to inclusion and start engineering it?
Well, I think what changes is it becomes more of an inclusive approach where you invite other thoughts, other opinions, other perspectives to the relationship such that it isn't about necessarily what you know and believe, but is learning to be curious, learning to be appreciative of others, and using that to inform the work that you're doing, the relationship, or the guidance that you want to give others, whether it's a student, a mentee, or a professional, or a leader that you're having a conversation with. Meet them where they're at And I know that I belong, as you've said here, is when you can do that and you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel dismissed or marginalized by what you're saying or sharing with others, that people are listening, they're asking for your thoughts and opinions and so forth.
That's really helpful because I think when leaders start really kind of tuning into understanding what's going on in the organization, they can really start to drive into engineer how they're going to create a culture that they deserve. I think that's really, really powerful. So, Effenus, it's not a name that people can forget. Once you hear it, you kind of know it. So take us to a specific moment when your name mattered in a room, a time when it was honored, or a time that it wasn't. What did it tell you about how you belonged someplace?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I have a good friend who is a industrial psychologist, and we were meeting in Southern California at a meeting. Actually, it was one of the meetings around standards and benchmarks. And by background, he is Jewish and has studied a lot of the literature that is in Latin and so forth. And he said, I think I've seen your name before, because I had no idea growing up on a small farm in eastern North Carolina. I thought my name was something that was passed down from the family, but we never really talked about it. But he said, I'm convinced that I've seen your name in the writings of Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus is a first century scholar who wrote a lot of the early work that led to the Bible. And he says, your name is there. So what inspired me and made me feel like I belonged was when I actually went searching for that. And I actually literally found a Latin in one of his works that had the name. It was all in Latin, so obviously I didn't have a clue about the context. But I said, oh, there it is. So if that was a moment when you knew you belonged, when your name, is something that's been recognized before you, and that it's something that is passed down through generations, through writings and so forth. So that was when I felt good and I felt like I belonged.
Well, there's very few people who can trace their names back centuries. So that's really cool to be able to see that. So that's awesome. So take us to the moment that you knew you belonged. Take us to the day that the ISO 30415 was published. Where were you when you knew that the language you helped shape was going to reach workplaces across dozens of countries? Take us to that moment. How were you feeling?
Well, the whole process of developing a standard like that takes years. It's not something that you do overnight. And in the development of it, you have to invite a certain number of people, experts, consultants, practitioners from around the world. So we had to have at least 10 or more countries represented in its development. And so the process was iterative. So you had to go through a process of responding to comments that people might have. You have to send it out and people have to respond to those comments. And then you'd have to resolve, the comments, either integrate them into the work or dismiss them or say it's already covered. And so that whole process through the several years that we worked on it was very challenging. And what I felt was, in the way that it finally ends up, it has to be voted on by the entire membership of the International Organization for Standardization. And I knew I belonged when I got the text message or the email message saying that the vote was positive, that they had accepted the recommendations that we had made, and it had become, as a result of that, the first global standard for diversity and inclusion. And I knew I belonged at that moment in seeing a work and something that you'd worked on be acknowledged by an international group of standards professionals and so forth.
Well, I just want to say thank you for that work, because as somebody who has been a DEI practitioner for a very long time, it is something that I would keep on my desktop and refer to it as I would implement policies or practices to make sure that we were following a standard that could be understood across the world. So I too do really appreciate the time and effort that you have done to bring that to fruition and keeping it alive. So I appreciate that. Thank you so, so much.
Well, thank you. The other part of that, in terms of knowing that I belong was when I became confident in writing about the work that I do, the diversity, equity. The standard
Dive into that.
was something that helped to set the stage for understanding if you're going to do this work in a transformative way, how do you do it? Who needs to be at the table? And what are the elements of that work? And so through that standards work, it led me to the development of my books, the SPINE model, which is around the concept of strategy, practice, ideation, need, and execution. It said the strategy part of it is that you really have to connect this work to the business or the organization mission and values. The P is that not only do you have to state it, but you have to actually operationalize it and practice it. So the P is really about practice. How do you make it simple enough and understandable enough so that a leader who's not a DEI practitioner or an HR professional can understand it and understand how to apply it in the daily work. So that's where the P comes from, the practice part of it, because people watch what you do, not necessarily just what you say, and they want to see to what degree there's an alignment between what you're telling me and how you're acting and behaving. So that the ideation part then was, as you look at becoming more creative and innovative in what you do in terms of services or products, you need a diverse range of perspectives about how to design and sell and market the product. And so for me, that part of it was really understanding that people have to feel psychologically safe and secure to share their thoughts and ideas, because if you're in a situation where your ideas are poo-pooed or dismissed or people say, that's a bad idea, it really deflates you, and you're not willing to, in the future perhaps, give the kind of input that you might otherwise if you felt like you belonged and you were appreciated and valued for the perspectives and ideas that you have. And so as the world becomes much more diverse, one perspective isn't going to cut it. You've got to look at all the perspectives that might impact what it is that you do. So that, and then the need part of it was, we just can't go out and do everything for everybody. We have to say, what's the most impactful things that we can do in integrating this work, diversity, into the organizational social system and social fabric? It isn't an end in itself. It's a lens in which you look at, how you establish the cultural practices and traditions, how you market to customers, how you serve the community, and how employees feel about their experience in the organizations in which they're operating. So that was kind of the end part, is the need, really focusing on those things where there may be some substantial gaps between the aspirations and the perceived reality of what things were at that particular moment in time. And then the E is just the execution. You just can't see it. You got to figure out a way to get it done, measure progress, and provide feedback and recognition for work that is helping you move along the way.
Wonderful. I really do appreciate you taking time to share that. So in preparation for this conversation, you shared with me that you've had younger people come up to you and say that the work you have done has given language that they didn't have before. And so when you hear something like that, how does it resonate with you? How does it make you understand belonging with something that you could not leave behind, but something you could only reach?
Well, I think for me, how it made me feel pretty good, but it also made me realize that people have their own experiences, their own lived experiences, their own background and worldview, and their cultural traditions, which really shape how they may think about the work. And for a young professional, I relate it to myself. When I first started professionally, my family were not professionals. They were working class people. I lived on a farm. And so when I first got a professional job, it was like, what do I do now? I got the job, and how do I show that I'm professional? So part of it was seeking out coaches and counselors that could help me navigate the environment, in which I was thrust in. But I recognize that hard work, just focus on the task at hand, understanding the expectations, and really focusing on that and asking for help and looking for people who could provide you insights into how you can do that better. Because I realized and saw myself at that moment in my career when, in many respects, I didn't have a clue. I was just trying to.
Yeah, I can understand that. There are many aspects in my career where I was like, I have no clue what's happening here. I'm just gonna hold on by the seat of my pants and we'll figure it out.
Exactly.
So I I appreciate all of that. And again, thank you for the work you've
But I
done.
think the thing,
So
let's just say one other thing about that, but the real key to it all was to I invited a young person to be curious, ask, seek information that might help you.
yep,
Don't wait to be invited. Just say, hey, I think I could do that. And what do I need to prepare and do to get prepared for that? So helping people find their agency, their voice, and how they can contribute, I thought was an important part of it as well.
absolutely, absolutely. So this show would not be the I Know I Belong When podcast if we also did not talk about the other side of belonging, or as we call it, non belonging. So earlier in your career, you were often the only Black executive in rooms where decisions about Black employees were being made. Take us inside one of those rooms. What was a moment where you realized that you were translating pain into business language just to be heard?
That's a heavy one. And I think there were a number of different experiences. I'll have to relate it to an early experience when, in my professional career, when I started out, and most of my career has been as an HR professional, not as a DEI practitioner. I started as a trainee. And one of the things that I recall was how people make assumptions about what's going on without seeing and without having a conversation. So one of my friends happened to be in college, happened to be a news reporter, right? And he was covering the area in which the mill, and I was at a mill in eastern North Carolina, and it had had its racial tensions and so forth in terms of discriminatory practices and so forth. And it started to try and address those. And I was invited in to help think about that. One of the days, my friend was covering a story in the area. And he called me and he said, hey, I'm in the area. I'd like to just come back and just check in and see how things are going and so forth. Not related to the job, but just because we were friends and we went to college together and so forth. And so he showed up.
Yep.
And he came, and at that time we had our individual offices where you could shut the door and so forth. So he came and I invited him in, we shut the doors, just had a conversation. And I realized that there was some clamor and commotion going on outside of my office. And I didn't pay any attention to it, but after we finished up, he said farewell and left. My boss came in and wanted to say, what? I want to know what the hell is going on around here. I said, what? He said, I want to know what the hell's going on. And a light bulb went on in my head. It says, oh, he thinks because what had happened, I didn't realize it. My friend drove up in the WNCT TV car. And I didn't realize that until he left. And so I said, oh, he thinks that I am maybe doing something, complaining to the press or something like that. I said, oh, I know what you're thinking. You think that I am about to disclose something about what's going on here at this organization. I said, he was just my friend showing up and stopping by to say hello. And I said, but if there is ever an incident where I think it merits your attention, don't worry, I'm going to tell you. But I said, but he was just a friend. But I said, I realized at that moment, being one of the only Black executives there, my friend being Black coming in, and with the TV, how context matters in certain situations and so forth.
Yes.
How people make assumptions based on that. So it was a learning for me in terms of professionalism and understanding people's reactions and things that can trigger an emotional response. But it was just an interesting thing. The other thing, and I'll mention this, is I was in recruiting at the time, and I went out and we were trying to get chemical engineers, and we wanted to increase the number of African Americans in engineering. And so I identified a candidate out of Georgia, African American chemical engineer, who came and we asked him to work. We offered him the job and he accepted and he started working. And so as we were working, he was one who liked to golf. That's kind of how I got fascinated with golfing, right? But during that time, the golf courses were not integrated. And so we said, this is interesting. But we were in a small town, and most of the leaders at the mill would go to that same place to have lunch. And none of the black employees would go there. We said, why aren't y'all going down? we kind of knew why they weren't, but we said, let's see what happens if we show up there one day. So we actually decided to go and have lunch there, and just to see if most of our peers and folks in the mill were going there. The question is, why couldn't we go as well? And so we went there, we were served, we had lunch, and we left. And it was kind of one of those moments where you say, oh, we can eat, we can eat here. You know what I'm saying? It was just kind of that fear, that angst about going, and whether or not people thought we might be just trying to make a scene, but we're just trying to benefit from the same things that everyone else were benefiting from, having lunch at a place. And it was kind of the best place to have lunch at in that particular community. And as professionals, we thought that we should be able to go there as well. But we also were fearful because we weren't sure how people might take us showing up. And so that was a learning experience, because sometimes we put boundaries around it. And so that was a situation where I knew I belonged in a certain way because I could go there and I didn't get any kind of pushback or asking me to leave. So that was a very pivotal one in my early career. I don't know if that makes sense.
So it does. And to help kind of just ground people in how long that might not have been ago, what year was that?
What year was that? That was about 1974, 75. Yeah, so it was a number of, it was a few decades ago, but it was just a few. But it was just kind of how things were then, and in a place like in eastern North Carolina, very small town, and a lot of bias is still there and a lot of segregation. And so it was something that you had to navigate that community in that way. But this belonging thing, I knew, as we started to work there, the mill and the leadership there started to really help to make us feel comfortable by inviting us, to things and to encouraging us to take on responsibilities and so forth. And so that, for me and others, was important. But it was also important because I was learning, not just because of being a black man, but just learning, being a person who'd never worked in industry before, what some of the protocols and traditions and so forth that would work if I expected to succeed there. I remember one other time when I was there, senior vice president from the headquarters here in Seattle, and this is how I got to Seattle, Washington, came to the mill, and he was going on and on about how much work the company had been doing to increase the numbers of people of color in key positions within the organization. And so I remember this, I raised my hand in the meeting and said, excuse me, Mr. Vice President, I won't mention names, but can you tell me where these people are? Because quite honestly, I don't see them. And I caught him off guard with that question, but he fumbled with it.
I'm sure he did.
But 2 weeks later,
because leaders today would even fumble with that question.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Right. It was, even though it was maybe about 50 years ago, if we kind of think leaders still today are going to fumble.
Leaders today still fumble
when we go.
But what happened was, by being at least somewhat confident and assertive, 2 weeks later, I got a call from him. He wanted me to come to Seattle to interview for a job in a corporate college relations group. And I came out and interviewed, and I was offered the job. And that's how I continued my career at warehouses. So it's those moments when, there's a time to ask the question, when people are saying things and you're not sure because you don't see it, that you ask the question. I knew I belonged when I felt comfortable asking the question and not getting shot down for it. that was a moment. One other moment, and I'll tell a lot of folks this one, fast forward several years later, maybe even 10 years later, I'm still working with the company, and in organizations to periodically their organizational changes, redesigns, and so forth. And I was in a role in supporting one of the business units, and it felt like I'd made suitable progress. But they hired a new leader of the HR function, and he came in and told me that he was going to redesign all of the positions, and the position that I held at that moment was going to be eliminated, and that they were restructuring the roles. That he said, but don't worry, we'll have a job for you somewhere in the organization. It might be in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, or somewhere, but that you'll have a job. And I was a little bit torn about, I was a little bit upset about it. And I said, he doesn't really know me that well, and how can he make that decision that I'm not qualified for one of those 4 jobs? Because I, in my heart, knew that I was. So I said to myself, I belong in one of those roles. I'll put it that way. And but it's up to me to show that leader why I believe I belong there. And so I spent the weekend, and this was pre-emails, this was pre-technology as we have it today, actually pre-PowerPoint presentations and so forth. But I said I need to, because he came out, he was not an HR professional, he was a general manager who came into the function. So I said I need to demonstrate to him that I think I'm competitive for one of those jobs. And so the first thing I did, I brushed off my resume. But I said, it's not enough just to brush off the resume. I have to talk about the experiences that I've had, which I did. Yep. But I then said, he also is kind of trying to chart a new direction. So I needed to show him how I felt that I could help shape that direction of the function going forward. And so when we left the meeting that Friday, he said, think about kind of where you might want to go in the organization, and we'll figure out something for you. And I said, it's not going to end like that. I said, so over the weekend, I went back and I said, I worked on all of this stuff, and I went back in that Monday, and he says, well, have you thought about what you're going to do? I said, yeah, I said, obviously you don't know me well enough to make that kind of decision. So my challenge here in this meeting today is to convince you otherwise, that I am qualified in what I would do in terms of taking the lead on that area, or one of the areas. And let me share with you my thoughts and ideas, because quite frankly, that is not an option in terms of moving the family and myself to another part of the country that I'm not necessarily enamored with going. But I want to share with you kind of where I am on this. So I actually went through a process of sharing with him what I'd worked on a whole weekend. And a couple of days later, came back and said, okay, we're going to give you one of those 4 jobs. So I actually got one of them. and I became the director of international HR. And that's where my work in diversity started to accelerate, because the cross-cultural learning, the immigration issues, the benefits work in different countries started to be a part of my responsibilities and so forth. And it was actually kind of one of those pivotal moments, because I could have said, oh gosh, I don't have any opportunity or choice, so I've got to look somewhere else. But I knew I belonged.
You made the opportunity and choice. You didn't give them any other option, right? You were like, we're gonna.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about my early history. So that sort of grounding helped shape the development of who I am over the years, and my interest and passion for this work.
Well, Effenus, thank you so much for sharing that. I do really appreciate it. So we could be talking for hours about all the work you've done and how you've shaped this profession, but that's another podcast. So I would like us to move this conversation along.
Sure.
And I want to talk about how you model belonging. So set aside the frameworks for a moment. Tell us about a person you helped so they knew that they belonged, something you specifically did or built so someone else could stand a little taller in the room that was not made for them.
Well, I have several folks that I currently mentor and have mentored them for years. And part of it was creating an environment where they could come and talk about what they were going through, what they were experiencing at the time, and to bounce off ideas about how to get through that, how to work through it and get better. And so I talked about, it was something that one of the vice presidents talked to me about, one of our first female vice presidents at Weyerhaeuser when I was there. We invited her in a workshop to talk about her evolution as a leader. She talked about three things, which I try to model as well. It's first of all, let's take a look at your background and so forth. Three things: experience, education, and exposure. So first of all, what is it you're trying to do? Where are you trying to aspire to? What kind of experiences do you have? And are your experiences, no, what kind of education do you have? And is that education that type of education that will help you move in that direction? If you don't have it, then you've got to make up for it in some way through experience by on the job training and education and learning. And then you got to be exposed to the people who can help shape and help you advance in the organization. So exposure through assignments, working on task forces, and things like that were very important. So I said, you can't wait. One of the key things I pressed upon people is that I grew up in a time when, the leaders kind of dictated what was to be said in meetings and so forth. And you waited for the leader to give the direction and so forth. But what I learned was that's not helping. What you have to do is to learn to share your ideas and thoughts. And if you see something that you feel like you can contribute to, whether it's a job opportunity or promotion, raise your hand and say, I think I can do that. Help me understand what I need to do to get prepared for that. And then start to work and then to try to put yourself in places and in front of people that make those decisions about whether or not you're going to advance and so forth. So I've worked with individuals to help them think about it that way. But the bottom line is you've got to perform, you've got to do well, and you've got to understand kind of the contextual values of that organization and so forth to do that effectively and so forth. So part of what I've done over the years is I can cite a number of folks that I've worked, some in very specific areas, in terms of capability, others in terms of a cultural, how do I adapt, how do I adjust, how am I coming across, how do I even dress, in terms of for success in that organization. So you got to prepare yourself as if you're in the job right above you for people to start to notice you, and you've got to be vocal and to speak out. And so helping people get comfortable leading into those kinds of moments that could feel a little bit unsettling and so forth. And that's what I've done.
Well, Effenus, thank you so much, because I think it's really powerful, especially for some of the younger professionals out there, is that don't wait, right? Make sure you're raising your hand and engage in the conversation, because if you keep waiting, you're always going to wait, right? You got to actually take a little bit of control of your career and tell people what you need and what you want so that they know how to help you. I think that's really, really powerful. And also just sometimes you got to build the room yourself, right? Sometimes the rooms, weren't built for you in mind. Well, then go build your own room, right? And shine there. So thank you for that.
Could I just say something? Because you mentioned a word that's part of what my next book is about. It's called The Architecture of Inclusion. And so it's about building and understanding that if you're building something, all of the parts have to matter. And if you think of this work in human resource management as a system, a social system, if you sub-optimize one aspect of it, you're not going to get the best results. So thinking about the work and thinking about how you show up and how you contribute is important, because if you're not giving your best, if you're not feeling like you belong there, you're less likely to be as good at the work, because you don't feel like you're being valued, or people are not listening to you or inviting you to talk about what your ideas and opinions are about something. So part of the architecture of inclusion is really looking at it from that standpoint and looking at it in a variety of domains of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So As we start to bring this conversation to a close, because we could talk for hours, I know we could, I have a fun little question for you. So, as we shared at the beginning, you have written more than 60 original songs. So, what is the one you reach for, yours or someone else's, when you need to feel most like Effenus? What song is that for you?
Wow, that's the way I write. I write, number one, I use technology to produce the songs. I use Suno. So what I do is I have a feeling that I want to express or an idea that I want to express, and then I use it to create a set of lyrics, and then I use Suno to help produce a song. One of the songs this year that I've worked on is, let's think which one it is. Well, the one that I worked on, even just for this one, is I Know I Belong When. And I use the moment to try to define the song that I write. And so there's not one that I would point to that's, but let me think about that, because I've got so many of them. Gee.
I know it's like picking your favorite child.
Yeah.
I get it. I get it. I'm asking you to pick one. And so if you don't have one, that's okay. Maybe kind of like the feeling that the group of songs have. Like when you need to feel like most like Effenus, what is the type of song you're looking to listen to when you just need to ground yourself or escape the moment?
Yeah, there was one that I wrote last year called Let It Go. You know, at some moment when you're holding on to something that's really hurting you or not helping you, or is a frustration that you felt, learning how to let it go and so forth. So that's one. There's one about that's hard. I mean, there's so many. I have to look at my catalog and see which one that I really appreciate.
That's okay. I understand. I can't make you pick a favorite. Just like when somebody asks me which is my favorite son, I was like, I have two, because I have two sons. So I totally get it.
Well, there is one this year that's sort of an interesting one, and folks have. There are two. One is called Press On. You know, it's a song about continuing to press on even when things seem to be working against you and so forth. So it's the notion of continuing to press on with the work in spite of the obstacles that you're facing. You can get through it and so forth. Another one is I'm Coming Out. It's based off of that song of the 80s, Diana Ross.
Yep. Well, I know that song very well.
But this particular one is I'm Coming Out as it relates to the social movement today, you know, in terms of the march and the protest against what they see as bad treatment and so forth. So rather than sitting at home and stewing about what we're seeing on television, I'm coming out, I'm bringing my posters, and I'm making my signs. And so that's one that is relatively recent as well.
So, Effenus, where can we listen to these songs?
Yep.
Because I now am intrigued and I want to go listen to them.
They're on YouTube. So just type my name in.
Okay.
But I'm actually in the process of creating what's called the platform, the HenderWorks platform HenderWorks, which has all of the songs listed with a link to the YouTube channel where you can actually capture those. But if you actually go to YouTube, you can find some of those as well.
Wonderful. Well, we will put the link in the show notes. So, folks, if you're looking for the link, we will put it in the show notes for you so you can go right and listen to those songs, because I know what I'm going to be adding to my listening right now, because I want to learn. I really need the one that's talking about coming out and getting involved in the movement and making sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable to making sure that they are creating a society in which we know that everyone will belong. Because right now, I don't think we have one of those.
Exactly.
And we got to work towards that. So speaking of that, what is the call to action? What is the something that, you want people, once they finish listening to this episode, that you want them to practice inclusion with a little bit more rigor, not less? What's that call to action for them?
Well, I think don't get discouraged. If you study history, you see these cycles and times. Part of what I believe is happening right now is people are trying to intimidate, to create fear, and to really generate a lot of mistruths and, quite frankly, disinformation about this work. And my view is to really challenge that when you see these slogans and these disinformation coming out, think about it and frame it in the positive way in terms of becoming more inclusive society and so forth, where everyone, it's not me against you, it's all of us trying to think about how to work more effectively together in our teams, in our organizations, in our communities and so forth. So part of it is really not to give up hope. And even in those periods when you feel like, oh, what's the use because the funding has been cut, you don't maybe even have a job, but use those moments to reflect and to create things that could help you in the next evolution and period of time in your life's journey and so forth. But too often people give up. But I'd say don't give up, just to start to think about how to use those periods to create, to get better, and to really defend the positions that you believe are important in society as a whole.
I could not agree with you more. This is not a time to give up. This is a time to dig in and defend the work. So, Effenus, I really do appreciate that. So as we close out our show, Effenus, you have spent a lifetime proving that belonging can be designed, built, and standardized for the whole world. You have handed thousands of leaders the blueprint to do it. However, this is your moment. No ISO standard, no framework, no title, no resume, just you finishing the sentence that closes our show. I know I belong when?
I know I belong when I find others seeing that they belong as well and can approach and work with me collaboratively in solving the problems, and that I'm being invited into those circles where it makes a difference. Because being silent, being withdrawn from society and so forth is not going to cut it. And so I know I belong when I'm invited, when I'm sharing, and when people are listening, and when I can see the frailties that sometimes are exhibited in others in my own self, that I'm not perfect. I'm a continuous learner. I'm trying to get better. And that in this new environment, no one individual has all the answers. No one individual can solve the issues. And with technology, you've got a lot of ways of augmenting kind of information and knowledge and so forth. And so I know I belong when I'm getting better at using technology and artificial intelligence to help expand how I think about issues and how I can understand patterns of behavior and trends. And so I think, I know I belong is when I'm continually learning and developing and growing in my own way. Does that make sense?
There was a lot there. And no, it does. It does. And I think it's a great way to close out the show and remind people that learning is continuous. We don't stop, right? We always have to keep learning. We're always learning new things, and how is it shaping us? So Effenus, thank you so much for this presentation. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
This has been a great reminder that belonging is not a destination. It is a practice, and it starts with listening. Friends, if this episode challenged you to move outside your comfort zone, please follow our show and give us that 5-star review you want to give, and add a comment about what you will do to champion a culture of belonging. These actions will help to amplify the message to others so they too can find their own moment of belonging. Whether it is navigating the complexities of workplace culture, finding acceptance in a new school, building trust in a local community, or forging identities within our own families, these stories reflect the raw, honest, and unfiltered journeys each of us take every day. And we want to hear from you. Finish the sentence, I know I belong when, and send us a voice note. Your story could open a future episode. Thank you for listening. Know that your bold, authentic self is welcomed, valued, and loved. And until next time, remember, you belong here.